Fantasy football is the absolute worst when your team does nothing on Sunday. They underperform. You're just sitting on your couch waiting for those fantasy points to come piling in, and they never do. It's frustrating. Your day is ruined. Your week is ruined. But the other side, when your team is going off, you're crushing your friend by 90 points by the time Sunday Night Football rolls around. It's the absolute best. You love it. That's what we live for. Well, if you have one of these guys on this list, that's going to be you on Sunday. You're going to be feeling really good because I think these 10 players in this video go absolutely crazy in week 8 of fantasy football. Let's start with my bold call of the week, Woody Marks, who thankfully regained the starting role for the Texans coming off their bye week as he saw 61% of the snaps, 10 of the 15 running back carries, both of the red zone rush attempts, along with 20 routes, 5 targets. Houston, please stop wasting your time with Nick Chubb. It's over for Chubb. He's washed. He's not good anymore. Like, lean on your rookie back. And while he didn't do a ton for your fantasy team in week 7, Mark said he did squeak in that last minute receiving touchdown, saved his fantasy day, 12.5 fantasy points. If you started him, you were really happy to see that. He had 10 carries for 15 yards. Yeah, that's horrible, but it was against a pretty good Seattle run defense. But still, you obviously don't love to see that. I think he's going to have an easier time, though, in week 8 against the San Francisco 49ers, who have allowed 4.6 yards per carry since losing Nick Bosa. We know they don't have Fred Warner. They're obviously a beat-up defensive unit at this point, along with allowing 1.5 yards before contact per carry. That's the 6th most in the NFL. And with the Texans probably trailing for most of this game, who do they have on offense to rely on? Nico Collins out with that concussion. Like, Marks is going to be the guy for them, not only on the ground, but through the air, which we know Marks is a really good receiving back. I think you could obviously do a lot worse than throwing Woody in your flex, considering 6 teams are on bye. There's injuries all over the place. I will say this is more of a volume play than anything. I can see Stroud checking it down to Marks 4 to 5 times in this one. And I also wouldn't be surprised if Woody squeaks into the end zone as well. All right, moving on to our next guy, Courtland Sutton, who's having a great fantasy year, but he's had a couple of those games where you're like, he just does nothing. He either scores 16 plus fantasy points in a game or less than 3. He's only had a couple of those bad performances, but there's no real in between with Sutton. It's like he goes off or he does nothing. But like I said, he has been pretty consistent this year as he scored 16 plus fantasy points in 5 out of 7 games and put together a really strong performance in a shootout last week. 6 receptions, 87 yards on 10 targets, 16.7 fantasy points. Not a huge day, but he still got it done. And Courtland continues to lead this Broncos wide receiver room in all major categories: targets, routes run, air yards. And obviously Sutton has been really good for the most part this year, but starting him this week, the reason why I think he's going to go off more than anything, it's about the matchup. He's going against the Dallas Cowboys, who have a terrible secondary, as they are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. No Travion Diggs in this one as well. So they have no one on defense to stop the pass. And on top of that, this Dallas Cowboys offense is humming right now. It's one of the best offenses in football. They're going to put up a lot of points, even against the Denver Broncos, who are a good defense. I don't think it's going to matter, which means we could have a shootout on our hands, which means the Broncos are going to have to throw the football a ton if they want a chance at winning this game. And if they do that against a really bad secondary, then yeah, Courtland Sutton is going to eat in this one. It's a pretty easy call. It's a pretty obvious one, but if you have him on your roster, you can feel really good about it. I also like Troy Franklin as a little bit of a sleeper here. Broncos receiver. He's not to the caliber of Courtland Sutton, obviously, but if you're looking for a sleeper in this game, I do really like Troy Franklin this week. All right, moving on to our next guy, Breece Hall. It's been brutal. We talk about Breece Hall, I feel like every week that he should be a start, and he just never comes through for you. A lot of the problem is this Jets offense. Everything about the Jets, again, this year, I'm kind of shocked. But again, it's horrible. The coaching staff, the quarterback, everything. It just, when is this culture in New York going to change? I feel horrible, whoever is a Jets fan, because it just seems like it's never going to end. But Breece, really good player. He did log a full practice on Friday, so he's going to play in week 8. And we know he's been dealing with what looks like a pretty minor knee injury, so I'm not overly worried about it. But we don't really know who the starting quarterback is going to be because Aaron Glenn just refuses to tell us, probably because he's 0-7 and just, he's upset. But if I had to guess, I'm assuming it's going to be Tyrod Taylor as QB1 just because Justin Fields has looked horrible all year. If Tyrod does play, he is an upgrade at quarterback for fantasy purposes as he's more willing, more likely to check the ball down to Breece Hall. Throw the ball to Breece Hall. Like, I just don't understand. He's such a great receiving back. There's no Garrett Wilson in this game. Like, I'm assuming Tyrod will, and Taylor will be able to move the ball down the football field. He can operate an NFL offense to a much better degree than Justin Fields can. Again, it's ugly. It's not fun. We've gotten to the point where you don't really even want to play Breece Hall because it's just been so bad. But with all the teams on bye, all the injuries, you are starting Hall this week. And all the advanced metrics underlying data is telling us that Breece is still playing really good football this year as he ranks first in explosive run rate, 14th in missed tackles forced per attempt. It just hasn't resulted in a lot of fantasy points because of the offense that he's in. But Breece does tend to perform better in easier matchups. Obviously, every player does, right? But like if it's a hard matchup for Breece or a mild, medium matchup, he's still not going to come through for you. But if it's an easy one, you can take it to the bank as he had 16 fantasy points in week 4 against the Miami Dolphins, who we know is a terrible run defense, 17.5 fantasy points in week 5 versus Dallas, not a good run defense either. And this week he gets the Cincinnati Bengals, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game to running back. So it's about the matchup. It's going to be an easy matchup. It's about Tyrod Taylor hopefully being the QB1. And the Bengals have also allowed the second most rush yards and 4th most receiving yards and have allowed 9 running backs to score 15 plus fantasy points. Like, you're starting Hall because he is a talented player. If Tyrod can operate this offense just at an average level, I think Hall could eat. So get him in your lineup, feel really good about it. And I do think he has one of his best games of the season. All right, moving on to our next guy, Stefon Diggs, who is just playing at a different level right now. Like, he continues to impress considering he's 31 years old, coming off a major knee injury, torn ACL, doesn't matter. Diggs continues to ball. And since week 4, he's been really good. Wide receiver 11 in total fantasy points, averaging 15.1 fantasy points per game, along with a 30% target share, which is 5th in the NFL, 31% of the team's air yards, 33% first read share. And on the year, he ranks 4th in targets per route run, behind only Puka Nacua, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Rashee Rice. That's insane. He's also 3rd in yards per route run. Like, he's getting it done. It's not just because Drake May is throwing him the football. He's been really good. But obviously, he is May's favorite target in the passing game, who's playing out of his mind right now. Drake is looking like he could be the MVP this year. Like, he is playing exceptional football right now. And Diggs, because of that, has seen the highest catchable target rate through 7 weeks among receivers at 91%. Like, how lucky is Stefon to go from Josh Allen to a mini Josh Allen in Drake May? Like, he is spoiled. And this duo between Diggs and May is lethal, and they're only going to get better, which is pretty scary. And I think Stefon stays hot in week 8 against the Cleveland Browns, who are allowing 29.9 PPR fantasy points per game to receivers this season. You can mark it down. You can take it to the bank. I think Diggs scores his first touchdown as a New England Patriot this week. All right, moving on to our next guy, DeAndre Swift, who is on an absolute heater over these last 2 weeks. He is cooking right now. He's the RB6 in fantasy, averaging 23.2 fantasy points per game, back-to-back 100-yard rushing performances, along with 7.1 yards per carry. What happened to the Swift that I know? Because this is not him. And he's combined for 46 fantasy points over the last 2 games. Obviously, this entire rushing attack of the Bears is crushing it right now. Everything is working from the scheme to the offensive line, as this offensive line is also playing great football as they rank top 5 in run block win rate and 2nd in yards before contact. So yeah, they're getting it done. They've learned the ropes, obviously, from Ben Johnson, who is a great coach, especially when it comes to running the football. But Swift does deserve some of the credit. It's not all about the system, as DeAndre ranks 2nd in explosive run rate, behind only Devon Achane over these last 2 weeks, and honestly looks like a completely different running back as of late. The matchup in week 8 could not be easier, as he's going up against the Baltimore Ravens, who have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs this season. We know the Ravens are coming off a bye, so maybe they tighten some things up, figure some things out. but I doubt it. I think DeAndre is going to continue to ball if he's out there, if he's fully healthy. As we know, he's been on the injury report with a groin injury. He was a limited participant in practice, but I feel like that's the Swift way. It seems like every week he's on the injury report, and then on Sunday, he goes out there and goes absolutely crazy. So I think this is another smash spot for Swift, and if he's on your team, you are feeling really good right now. All right, moving on to our next guy, Zay Flowers, who's just got to be so happy that his QB1 and Lamar Jackson is potentially going to return this week after he logged a full practice on Friday. Let's be honest, everyone in Baltimore is excited for Lamar to return because the Ravens have a huge hole to dig themselves out of as they're sitting at 1-5. Not great, but don't forget what Flowers can do on this potent Ravens offense. Don't forget kind of how it was trending for Zay this year before Lamar went down, because it was looking like he was going to have a career year. It really was. And it started in week 1 versus the Bills. Flowers put on an absolute clinic, 7 receptions, 143 yards, got into the end zone, 28.1 fantasy points. And the key here is Flowers is finally being used downfield. He's not used as much in that little gadgety role where he has like 7 catches for 40 yards. No, thankfully they're letting him work downfield, use that explosiveness after the catch, and he's currently sporting a career best 2.35 yards per route run. He's the wide receiver 23 right now in fantasy points per game with a 27% target share, 32% first read share. I would be buying low on Flowers before Sunday because I think, like I said, he's going to have a monster second half of the year. This is a really talented player that if they just use him more and if those touchdowns increase, he could be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. No doubt about it. And Mark Andrews kind of fizzling out. I do like Isaiah Likely. We know Bateman, DeAndre Hopkins will be sprinkled in, but Flowers is the guy in this passing attack. And with how bad this Ravens defense is looking this year, they're going to have to throw the football. And last year in games where the Ravens were trailing and they had to throw the football, Zay Flowers was incredible. So that's all you need to know. Like, Flowers wasn't great last year because the Ravens defense was awesome. They were winning most games and they just ran with Derrick Henry. That is not going to be the case this year. So if you can get Flowers on your team before Sunday, I would absolutely be doing so because I do think he has a huge game against the Bears, who are going to be down 2 of their top starting corners in the secondary. And on top of that, they're already allowing the 9th most fantasy points to receivers this season. So start Flowers with confidence, and I would be expecting a huge game. All right, moving on to our next guy, Cam Skattebo, who you guys all know we love on this channel. He's been incredible so far this year, RB10 in fantasy, averaging 16.8 fantasy points per game. And he's coming off a nice game in week 7, 16 carries, 60 yards, 3 receptions, 34 yards, and he got into the end zone on that nice receiving touchdown from Dart, 18.4 fantasy points on the day. That was a really strong, impressive, encouraging performance for Cam against a really good Denver Broncos defense. And while his snaps did drop slightly to 60% as Tyrone Tracy was more involved, I don't expect that to hold, and I don't think anyone that's a Giants fan wants that to hold either, because Skattebo is far and away the much better player than Tracy is at this point. He's way too valuable to this Giants offense, as Skattebo ranks 3rd in missed tackles forced per attempt, 6th in yards after contact per attempt, 90 plus scrimmage yards in 5 straight games. I don't know how this man fell to the 4th round of the NFL draft, because he is a phenomenal player. He's a phenomenal teammate, and he's going to continue to be the engine of this Giants ascending offense. And he gets the Eagles again in week 8. We know he just shredded them a couple weeks ago for 3 touchdowns, 31 fantasy points. I will say, this is important. The Eagles were down Jalen Carter, their best defensive lineman, in that game. Carter will be active in this game. Do I think he completely stops Skattebo from doing anything? No, but Carter is a really good player. I think there's going to be situations where his presence is felt. But that being said, the Eagles still struggle to stop the run, as they are allowing the 8th most fantasy points to running backs this season. So while I don't think Cam puts up 31 fantasy points, I do think he has another strong performance against the Eagles in this one. All right, moving on to our next guy, DK Metcalf, who's coming off a really disappointing week 7 in that game against the Cincinnati Bengals. which turned into a shootout between two 40-year-old quarterbacks. It was one of the most entertaining football games I think I've ever watched. And some people were even calling it the Unk Bowl, which I think is very accurate and hilarious at the same time. But don't get it twisted. Those two quarterbacks balled out in this one. It was really fun to watch both of them. And DK kind of wasn't really involved. He only finished with 3 receptions for 50 yards on 5 targets, 8 fantasy points. And that game actually snapped his touchdown streak of 4 straight games. But I'm not really worried, as DK is still the guy for the Steelers when they throw the football, as he has 42% of the team's air yards, 21% target share, 23% target per route run, and he continues to be used as a downfield threat, which is how he should be used. That's the type of player he is. Arthur Smith is letting DK do what he's good at, which Arthur Smith hasn't done in the past. But DK ranks 5th in the NFL in yards per reception. You like to see that. He's going to continue to be the big play threat through the air for the Steelers. And while Metcalf doesn't have a game this season over 5 receptions, I think that could change on Sunday Night Football against the Green Bay Packers. We know it's a revenge game for Aaron Rodgers. We know Aaron Rodgers is going to want to crush the Packers, which means, how does he do that? He's going to want to throw the football a ton. He's going to want to throw a lot of touchdowns. And I just think a lot of that is going to go to DK Metcalf. And it's a fine matchup against the Packers, who have allowed the 7th most points per game to perimeter receivers. I would not be shocked if Metcalf has his best game as a Steeler in Week 8. Get him in your lineup. And I do think he's going to go off. All right, moving on to our next guy, Derrick Henry. Look at what Lamar potentially returning does. We have 2 Ravens on this list, probably something that hasn't happened all year long, but we know Henry came out in Week 1, absolutely went crazy in Henry fashion. He ran all over the Buffalo Bills for 169 yards, 2 touchdowns, 29.2 fantasy points. I remember sitting, watching the game, and having so much regret that I didn't have more Derrick Henry on more of my fantasy teams, because it was just like, oh, he's doing it again. But ever since that game, he's been relatively disappointing for the most part. Obviously, a lot of it isn't his fault. Lamar getting hurt, he's been out since Week 4, has not helped. And in result of that, Henry has scored 14 or less fantasy points in 5 out of 6 games this season. But he did have a nice game before they had their bye week, where he had 24 carries for 122 yards, 5.1 yards per carry. I don't think that the 31-year-old back is cooked. I don't think he's headed for a disappointing season. Henry is still an alien at this point, with everything that he's already been doing at the age that he is, with all the career touches that he has. Like, I think Henry is another guy that I would be buying low on now, if you can, before Sunday, because I do think he has a strong second half of the season, and I think he probably goes off in Week 8 against the Chicago Bears, who have allowed the 11th most fantasy points to running backs this season. You're obviously starting Henry, but I'm here to ease your mind, to let you know that Henry is probably going to have one of his best games of the season this week. It would not shock me at all if he has one of those games where he has like 2+ touchdowns and just continues to fall into the end zone. All right, moving on to our next guy, Devontae Smith, who's coming off his best game of the season last week against the Vikings. 9 receptions, 183 yards, a touchdown on 11 targets, 33.3 fantasy points. And you obviously love to see that, as this Eagles passing attack has looked very off. And I do think Devontae has been okay, everything considered. 24% target share, 33% air yard share, 72 receiving yards per game, 2.27 yards per route run, 30% first read share. Like, Hurts is looking for Smith, and he gets a rematch against the New York Giants this week. Last time they faced off in Week 6, Smith only had 49 receiving yards. I can't see that happening this week, because we know A.J. Brown is not going to be active in this one as he deals with a hamstring injury. I do think the Giants are able to put up points again on the Eagles, which means Philadelphia, you're going to have to throw the football if you want to win this time. So I do think Smith has a big game. I think he sees a ton of volume against a very beatable Giants secondary, who is allowing the 3rd most receiving yards per game and the 7th most fantasy points per game to slot receivers. So I do think Smith had a big game last week. I think he has another very strong performance in Week 8. That's all I have for you guys today. Really appreciate each and every one of you, all your support. It means a lot to me. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.